The hearing test that changed everything took 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I watched the clock on the wall the entire time, not because I was anxious about the results, but because I had run out of other things to look at that weren't her hands. My name is Joel Marsh. I was 37 years old, and I inspected bridges for a living, old ones. Mostly the kind the city keeps commissioning reports on and never quite getting around to fixing. My job was to find the place where something looked solid and wasn't. The hairline fracture in the support beam. The bolt that had been torquing wrong for a decade. The slow rust that started from the inside, invisible until it wasn't. I was very good at seeing the specific problem in things that most people walked across without a second thought. I was considerably less good at doing this with myself. 8 months before the morning I met Lena Voss, my fiance had sat me down at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood and told me, carefully and without anger, that she felt invisible when she was with me. Not unloved, invisible. I had asked what the difference was, which was apparently both the correct question and proof that she was right. She moved out the following week. I moved the kitchen table to the other side of the room. I don't know why. It didn't help. I had since become very efficient at being alone. I was starting to confuse that with being fine. The mandatory hearing test came courtesy of a worksite incident involving a pneumatic jackhammer, a malfunctioning shield assembly, and my long-standing professional habit of treating safety protocol as a suggestion when I was running behind schedule. HR scheduled the appointment. I showed up on a Tuesday morning at 9 with a travel mug of gas station coffee and approximately zero awareness of what I was walking into. The clinic waiting room smelled like fresh paint and managed calm, the deliberate neutral of a space that dealt regularly with people's fears and had learned not to add to them. I signed in. The receptionist said the audiologist's assistant had gone home sick and they were running about 20 minutes behind. I found a seat by the window, picked up a magazine from 3 years ago, and read the same paragraph 4 times. That was when the woman in the doorway appeared. Not because she was striking, I would not have been able to tell you in that first second whether she was tall or short, how old, what she was wearing. I didn't register any of that yet. What I registered was what she did before she spoke. She came through from the back of the clinic and paused just inside the waiting room, not hesitating, taking inventory. A quick scan, unhurried, that had the quality of a habit so old it had stopped looking like one. Then she moved efficiently, without appearing to hurry to the small table by the window where the magazines were stacked at a slight diagonal, and she straightened them. One small correction, quiet, like someone who moves through the world, adjusting what is slightly off and doesn't make it a performance. Then she looked up, found me, and said, "Joel Marsh?" Her voice was the kind that had been trained to carry without rising, the kind that expected to be listened to, not because it demanded it, but because it had stopped waiting on anyone else's permission. I stood up. "That's me. I'm Dr. Voss. My assistant is out today, so I'll take you through myself." She was already moving back toward the hallway. "Follow me." She didn't check to see if I was following. She already knew I would. There are people whose attention, when it finally lands on you fully, makes you aware of every approximation you have ever made about yourself, every sentence you have ever rounded up or down, every time you described your life using the word fine when you meant something more complicated. Lena Voss was that kind of person. I just didn't know that yet. The sound booth was small and very white. A window looked into the testing room. The instruments on the panel were arranged with the precision of someone for whom disorder was expensive here, not simply annoying. She gestured to the chair inside, handed me a set of headphones, and settled on the other side of the glass. Before starting the test, she adjusted something on the panel, checked it, adjusted it once more. "Hold the button down when you hear a tone," she said through the intercom. "Even if it's faint, especially if it's faint." I put the headphones on. The booth went quiet, not the quiet of an empty room or a late night. Something else entirely engineered, deliberate, the silence of a space designed to contain only what you put into it. I had stood on bridges at 4 a.m. in January and never felt anything like it. Something in my chest released slightly, the way a load-bearing beam shifts when you finally relieve the stress that's been on it. "It's quieter in here," I said, "than anywhere I've been in 6 months." I hadn't intended to say it out loud. On the other side of the glass, her pen paused above the clipboard. "That's the point," she said. "Nothing else." She moved on to the test. I pressed the button when I heard the tones, high frequencies, low ones, the space between them, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, and the clock above the window confirmed it every time I checked. When she opened the booth door, she was making a note on the clipboard. I assumed it was a pen she was writing with. "What is that?" I asked. She looked up. "What's what?" I nodded at what she was holding. She held it up briefly, then went back to writing. A mechanical pencil, 4 inches, maybe a little less. The yellow paint had worn away in the places where always happens, the barrel where thumb and finger meted, the flat at the top. The eraser was gone entirely, and no one had replaced it. The clip on the side had been bent backward at some point and left that way, useful to no one in its current position, kept anyway. It looked like something that had been through an enormous amount of use and several near misses with the trash can, and was still here, not because anyone had decided to keep it, but because throwing it away had never quite been done. She held it the way people hold things they no longer see. "It's a pencil," she said. "It's a very old pencil." "It is." She looked back at the clipboard. "The results from your test." The door was closed on that subject as efficiently as she had opened the booth, exactly the right amount of force. No more. I understood the pencil was not a topic she was making available. She walked me through the results. Mild high-frequency loss in the left ear. Nothing irreversible. Nothing unexpected for the incident I'd had. She wrote a referral in a small, clean hand on a notepad using a different pen for that, I noticed. A disposable one. Not the pencil. The referral pen had a cap. She handed me the paper. "Any questions?" she said. I almost said, "Is that pencil from someone?" I said, "The referral, does it have to be this clinic?" "No. Any audiologist. We're not territorial." The professional smile arrived, practiced, pleasant, the same smile the paperwork received. She stood. I stood. "Your hearing is fine," she said. "Mostly. The recommendation is to stop standing next to pneumatic jackhammers without adequate shielding." That seems self-evident in retrospect. It does. And yet, her tone was dry, perfectly level. I laughed before I could stop myself. A short, real sound, nothing rehearsed about it. She didn't laugh back, but something shifted in the set of her expression, briefly, like a room where the light changes and then corrects. Not cold, not performing professionalism, careful. There is a difference between the two, and I was trained to find it, and I should have let it go. "I inspect bridges," I said from the doorway. "Old ones. People ask what I do. I say structural assessment, and they nod and immediately stop listening." Something in her went still. Not uncomfortable, attentive. I've never found a better way to describe it either, I added. She looked at me. 1 second, maybe 2. The same quality of attention she had brought to the test panel, not social, not performative, calibrating, the look of someone deciding what precisely they were looking at. "I'll send the referral to your GP," she said. Not unfriendly, a close, which is different from a dismissal, and I knew the difference. I thanked her and stepped out into the corridor where a phone was ringing, unanswered somewhere down the hall. 2 nurses were having a conversation at a volume the hallway didn't require, and someone's equipment cart was producing a persistent electronic beep. I stood in it for a moment. I had just spent 11 minutes and 40 seconds in a room engineered specifically to hold nothing but what mattered. I was now in a hallway that held everything indiscriminately. I drove back to the Callaway Street overpass and spent the afternoon checking rebar exposure on a south-facing support column. I filed my report by 4. I ate dinner alone, a sandwich in my truck, watching the commuter traffic below. I did not think about Lena Voss. Not once. Not more than 3 or 4 times. Somewhere on the drive home, I found myself trying to remember whether the pencil had any writing on the barrel I might have missed. Whether there was a name, a word, something that would have explained what a person keeps something that worn for. I put that thought away. I had always been very good at putting things away. That was the part that was about to stop working. I did not go back to the clinic. That is the version of events I told myself for 3 weeks. I didn't go back. I didn't think about going back. I had a 6-month referral sitting on my kitchen counter, and 6 months was a very long time. And the whole thing was a routine medical appointment. And Lena Voss was a professional I had exchanged fewer than 200 words with in a sound booth in a building my firm had done structural work on 18 months ago. That last part was why I was back in the building. The West Wing expansion had a phased completion schedule. In phase 3, the new imaging corridor had a 6-month structural assessment written into the contract. My site supervisor was supposed to handle it. He pulled a muscle in his back. I volunteered, not because it was convenient, not because I had been looking for an excuse to be in that building, but because I was available and it was genuinely my job, and I repeated that to myself the entire drive over. I ran the inspection in the morning, 2 hours, clean report, no issues. I was heading back to the elevator when I heard her voice. Not what she was saying, just the register of it, that particular quality of precision, the way each word arrived fully formed. I knew it before I turned around. She was in the corridor outside the clinic, talking to a colleague in a low voice, coffee in one hand, clipboard under her arm. She had not yet seen me. I stopped walking. She said something that made the colleague laugh. Then the colleague went back through the clinic door, and Lena turned toward the elevator, and she saw me standing there like a man who had stopped walking for no professional reason in the middle of a hospital corridor. Mr. Marsh. A pause. Are you here for follow-up? Structural inspection. West Wing. She looked at the clipboard in my hand. How is the West Wing? Solid, I said. For now. For now, she repeated. Something in that seemed to interest her. Everything is for now, I said. The point is knowing which for nows need attention. She looked at me for one careful second, and then she said, your 6-month referral, you haven't scheduled it. It hasn't been 6 months. It's been 3. I didn't have an answer for that one. She let that sit for just long enough to be meaningful. I can put you in next Thursday if you want, she said. First appointment, 7:30, before the waiting room fills. Not because she was making room for me specifically, not because 3 months versus 6 was actually a clinical issue, because she had noticed I hadn't scheduled and she was giving me an exit from the reason I hadn't. I said yes. I don't know if either of us believed it was about the hearing. She nodded and went back through the clinic door. I went back to the elevator. I filed my inspection report in the truck with the engine running, heat going, watching the parking structure entrance without watching it. I stayed 20 minutes longer than I needed to. She didn't come out while I was there. That was the part I kept not thinking about on the drive home. The gala invitation came from my firm's director on a Wednesday evening, a 3-line email explaining that Callaway and Marsh had been selected for a citation at the Hargrove Hospital Foundation Benefit Gala, and that since he had a family conflict, would I mind representing the firm on Saturday? I minded in the abstract, deeply. I went anyway. Not because I wanted to network, not because I cared about a framed citation, because declining felt like the kind of thing a man does when he is contracting around something. And I had spent 8 months contracting, and I was trying to stop. The venue was the Hargrove Foundation's private hall, the kind of room that had been designed to feel expensive without appearing to try, which takes significant effort. Round tables, low lighting, the gentle acoustic torture of 40 overlapping conversations. I found my firm's name on a placard at a table near the back, which was fine with me. I ordered sparkling water from the nearest server and stood slightly to the side of the table, watching the room with the professional detachment of a man who had learned that any structure is easier to read when you stop standing in the middle of it. I had been there 17 minutes when I saw her. She was at the adjacent table. A department group I recognized the general register of people who work closely together and socialize reluctantly. The slightly formal way they held their drinks. She was in a dark green dress, and she was listening to someone across the table with the expression she used when she was paying attention and not performing it. Her hair was up. And in her right hand, absently, she was holding the yellow pencil, not writing with it, just holding it the way people hold things that are anchor points. Her thumb moved along the worn barrel once, then stilled. I looked away before she could look up. The speeches began at 8. Her supervisor was a man named Dr. Marcus Aldridge, senior ENT surgeon, department director, the kind of man who occupied space in a room as if he had reserved it in advance. He received his citation, with the graceful ease of someone who had received citations before and expected to receive them again. When he spoke well. He knew his audience. He was thanking the departments that supported ENT, the nurses, the technicians, our audiology colleagues, without whom the tests wouldn't get run, and one of the donors at Lena's table, an older woman in pearls, leaned forward and said, "What exactly does audiology handle?" "I've always wondered." Aldridge smiled. "Baseline assessments, primarily," he said. "Audiograms, that sort of thing. The diagnostic work, of course, the real interpretation that happens in surgical review, but the measurements have to come from somewhere." He meant it as a compliment. That was the worst part. I was looking at my water glass when I felt the change at the adjacent table. Not sound, temperature. The specific quality of air when someone decides not to say something they had started to think. I looked over. Lena was holding her wine glass, and her expression was the same polished, composed expression she had worn in the clinic doorway. The same one she had worn when she said, "Follow me," and already knew I would. Identical in every way to the expression she used when everything was fine, except her thumb had gone white on the stem. I knew that grip. Not the grip of someone angry, the grip of someone who has been here before, who knows how it ends, who has made peace with something that should not require peace. I set down my glass. I turned toward Aldridge's table. My voice was level. Dr. Voss diagnosed an auditory processing disorder in a child that 3 other specialists had missed. I said, "That's interpretive diagnostic work, as I understand it. I don't know what the surgical review would have looked like without the right information." The table went quiet. Not the loud kind of quiet, the kind where everyone recalibrates. Aldridge looked at me. I met his eye, not with hostility, with the plain expression of someone who has said an accurate thing and has nothing to add. I did not look around the table to assess damage. I turned back to my water glass. The dinner resumed. Conversations restarted. Aldridge said something smooth and transitional to the donor with the pearls, and the moment passed for the room. For the table, it was different. Lena did not look at me for the rest of the meal. Not because she was angry, not because she was grateful. I couldn't tell what she was doing, which was itself information. As the dessert course was cleared and people began to drift toward the bar and the coat check, I felt her lean slightly toward me, close enough that I could hear her without her raising her voice. "You didn't have to do that. I know." A pause. "How did you know about that case?" I had asked about her 3 weeks earlier when I'd scheduled the follow-up. Not deliberately, I had been talking to the receptionist, and she had mentioned, in the Way Clinic staff, mentioned things they're proud of, that Dr. Voss had caught something last spring that everyone else had missed in a 7-year-old. I had filed it away without deciding to. It had stayed. "I didn't invent it," I said. "I used what was accurate. She absorbed that." That's not what I asked. I know a colleague who brought their daughter in. The name came up in conversation. She was quiet. "You look like you'd been in that room before," I said. "I have been." Her voice was even 6 times in 4 years, and never said anything. She turned to look at me. Her expression was not what I expected. Not relief, not warmth, something careful, measuring. "Why did you?" she asked. I didn't have a polished answer. I said the plain one, because it was accurate, and because someone else was going to have to sit at your table for the next 4 years if nobody said it. Something crossed her face. Too fast to name. "That's a very structural way to think about it," she said. "I find the load-bearing problem and note it. That's the job." "And what is the load-bearing problem in your assessment?" I looked at her. "You've been carrying something for a long time that you were told was the appropriate weight." She went very still, not the still of someone who hadn't heard that before. The still of someone who hadn't expected to hear it from here. We left at the same time, without arranging it. The event was ending. Coats were retrieved, and we simply found ourselves walking toward the parking structure at the same angle. The night was cold and clear, the kind of February that had given up on snow and was just being blunt about it. She was quiet, not uncomfortable. Somewhere inside, something. I didn't feel it. At the second level of the parking structure, she stopped and reached into her coat pocket for her keys. The yellow pencil came out with them. She looked at it briefly, then closed her hand around it and kept walking. Not because she'd forgotten it was there, not because she wanted me to see it. She held it the way you hold something when you need to remember what you're certain about. My car's on 3, she said. I'm on 2. She nodded and kept walking toward the stairs. At the landing, she paused without turning around. The appointment is still Thursday, she said. 7:30. I'll be there. She went up the stairs. I stood on the second level in the cold, listening to her footsteps and not moving for slightly longer than made sense. The thing about a load-bearing problem is that once you've named it, you can't unfind it. I had named something tonight. I wasn't sure I'd named the right thing. Thursday came, 7:30. I was in the waiting room at 7:22, which was not something I was going to examine too closely. She came to get me herself again. Something had shifted in the corridor between us, not large, not named, just present the way a new load is present on a structure before anyone has run the numbers. She was professional. I was professional. We were both aware of being professional in a way that people only are when they have reason to think about it. In the booth, she calibrated the panel. Same routine, same engineered quiet. Any changes since last time? She asked through the intercom. Ringing, distortion, anything that seems different? No, I said. She ran the tones. I pressed the button when I heard them. 8 minutes this time, faster, more efficient. When she opened the booth door, she had the clipboard and the yellow pencil in the same hand, but she wasn't writing with it. She was just carrying it. Third time I had seen it, I had stopped pretending I wasn't keeping count. Results are consistent, she said. No change. Come back in 3 months. 3 months, unless something changes, right? We stood in a small white room with the results between us on the clipboard and the echo of everything we hadn't said at the parking structure still in the air. There's a coffee place, she said, without fully committing to the sentence until it was already out. 2 blocks. I have 30 minutes before my next appointment. Not because she owed me anything, not because 30 minutes was a clinically indicated follow-up. I said, lead the way. That was 6 weeks ago. The coffee had become a habit before either of us acknowledged it was a habit. Not every appointment, she only had so many openings, but enough that the woman at the cafe counter stopped asking us what we wanted and started making it when we walked in. I noticed the first time that happened. So did Lena. Neither of us said anything about it. We talked about work. Mostly, she told me about the mechanics of sound in a way that made me understand, probably for the first time, what an audiologist actually did, not the clinical description she had given Aldridge's table with her eyes, but the real version, the way the inner ear was architecturally beautiful, the way damage happened so slowly and quietly that by the time someone noticed, they had already been compensating for years without knowing it. The compensation is the problem, she said once, her coffee cup in both hands. The brain is very good at working around something broken. Too good. You stop hearing a frequency and you just reorganize everything else to fill the space. By the time you walk into a clinic, you've been telling yourself you hear fine for a decade. I said, that sounds like something other than hearing. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. Most things do. I was learning her tells. Not performing them. She wasn't a performer. But the places where she was careful, she always asked if the table was okay before sitting down, as if I might have a preference she'd overlooked. She apologized for things that didn't require apology, taking the last sugar, suggesting a different route when she thought I was turned around. She laughed at herself first, reliably, before anyone else could. She had grown very skilled at making herself easy to be around. Not because she was effortless, because she had spent a long time making sure she didn't require anything that might inconvenience someone else. I started being deliberate about noticing, not to fix anything, just to see it. On a Saturday at the end of March, she came over to look at the blueprints. She had asked 3 weeks earlier, offhandedly, whether she could ever see the bridge drawings, the actual technical ones, not just photographs. She said the structural logic of things interested her. I had said yes before I finished deciding whether it was a good idea. She sat at my kitchen table with her coat still on for the first 10 minutes because she was cold from the walk, and I made coffee while she spread the blueprints flat with both palms and looked at them the way she looked at everything carefully, without performing interest, just paying attention. I set the coffee beside her. Walk me through it, she said. So I did. The main span first. The support configuration, the original construction, 1,957. Back when they poured things to last, which was both the good news and the bad news, because the tolerances on the rebar were different then, and you couldn't read the current load against the original specs without adjusting for 50 years of traffic that nobody had anticipated. She asked questions that were better than she probably knew. They were not technical exactly, but structural. She understood the logic of weight and distribution. Where does the stress go when the path it expected is blocked? The same place it always goes, I said. Somewhere else. The question is whether that somewhere else was built for it. She looked at the blueprints for a long moment. No, she said quietly. And I wasn't entirely sure she was still talking about bridges. I was standing beside her chair, leaning slightly over the table to point out the south abutment. The angle put us close her shoulder near my forearm, her hair at my eye level. Neither of us moved away. Then she picked up the yellow pencil from where she'd set it beside the blueprint and traced a line, lightly. The main span, from the north anchor point to the center. The pencil on the paper made almost no sound. She was not writing anything, just tracing the line she had understood. I went still. She set the pencil down across the blueprint and looked up at me. There was a moment, not loud, not announced, the kind of moment that happens in the space between two people who have been careful with each other for 6 weeks and are suddenly irrevocably aware of it. Her eyes moved to the pencil on the paper, then back to me. I only use it for lines I'm certain about, she said. I did not move. Not because I didn't want to, not because I had misread the sentence. I had not misread it. She had just placed the only thing she used for certainty on the work I cared most about, and she had not taken it back. And I was standing close enough to feel the heat of her coffee cup still in the air between us. And everything in me said, this is the moment. This is the open door. Move. I listed the reasons not to. She was still learning what she was willing to trust. I still didn't fully understand what invisible felt like from the inside. 6 weeks was not enough time to know whether I was the person she deserved or just the one who happened to be standing in the right corridor on the right Tuesday. I had been wrong about my own readiness before, publicly and at some expense. I was afraid that if I reached for this and got it wrong, I would become one more thing that had convinced her to make herself smaller. Then the one reason that made all the others feel like what they were reasons, not facts. The pencil was still on the blueprint, and she hadn't taken it back. I said, that's a good line to be certain about. She held my gaze for one long second. Then she looked at the blueprint again. Her hand came to the pencil and closed around it. She stood. I should go, she said. I have a call at 2. Okay. I walked her to the door. She said goodbye with the expression she used when she was somewhere inside something and not ready to let it have a name yet. I said I'd see her Thursday. She nodded and left. I went back to the kitchen. The blueprints were still spread on the table. The line she had traced was there, faint, precise, the main span from end to end. I rolled them up that night with the line still in them and put them in the tube with the rest of the drawings. I did not erase it. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they are only pretending to be. She was busy. She texted briefly, pleasantly. I was busy. I texted the same. We were both proficient at busy. I ran a deck inspection on the Merritt Avenue overpass on Wednesday with a crew of 3. One of them was Hideo Tanaka. I'd worked with him off and on for 11 years. A careful man, methodical, the kind who double-checked everything and almost never got it wrong. On the walk back to the vehicles, he said something about a woman he'd been close to for 5 years. Not a relationship, not officially. And almost, she's getting married in June, he said. I stopped walking. Hideo, I kept waiting until I was sure I wouldn't mess it up. He said it without self-pity. Worse than if there had been self-pity. Turns out that's not a waiting problem. It's a math problem. You wait long enough, the variable changes. I stood there in my sight jacket in the wind with a clipboard I'd forgotten I was holding. Are you sure now? I asked, that you wouldn't have messed it up. He looked at me. What does that have to do with anything? I drove home and looked at the rolled tube of blueprints for a long time. On the 11th day, she texted at 8 in the evening. You mentioned you'd show me the bridge sometime. Is that still available? I typed and deleted 3 responses. Sent, Saturday, 9 a.m. Dress for weather. Her reply, I always dress for weather. Then, you knew that already. Carver was there when we arrived. Felix Carver, 64, 32 years in structural inspection, the man who had trained me and who moved across a worksite with the slow certainty of someone who had never once hurried and was right more often than anyone who had. He was running his own check on the north abutment when we came up the access walkway. He lifted a hand in greeting. I introduced them. He shook her hand and asked what she did. She told him. He nodded once with the expression of a man who found this genuinely interesting rather than politely acceptable. The three of us walked the span for a while. I showed Lena what I'd shown her on paper, the load paths, the stress distribution, the original work and the repairs over it. She listened with her full attention, which was the kind of attention that made you say more than you'd planned because you could feel it receiving things properly. Carver peeled off at the midpoint to finish his section. We kept walking. At the far end of the span, Lena stood at the railing and looked at the water below. The March wind was doing what March wind does. She had her hands in her coat pockets. It's different when you're standing on it, she said. On paper, it's a logic problem. Out here, it's a decision someone made. Thousands of decisions, I said. Every bolt, every pore, and it holds so far. She turned and looked at me with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been building toward for longer than the current conversation. I heard footsteps on the access walkway behind us. Carver, heading back toward the gate. He slowed when he reached us. He looked at Lena. He looked at me. The look lasted 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Carver needed to assess most things. He opened his mouth. Carver looked at us for 3 seconds. Then he said, to no one in particular, but facing me, you watch her the way you watch a structure you've decided is worth understanding. He said it the way he noted things on a site report, without editorial, just an observation that had been sitting in him since he'd seen us together and was now apparently more useful outside. He looked at Lena once, a brief, level look, the look of a man who saw people with the same economy he brought to everything else. Then he nodded, lifted his hand in a half wave to both of us, and walked back toward the access gate. Just that. No speech, no ceremony. Carver had always believed that a single accurate sentence was preferable to any number of well-intentioned ones. We stood at the far end of the span. The wind came off the water in long, cold pulls. Below us, the river was gray and very flat. Neither of us said anything for long enough that the silence earned a name, not the empty kind, not the comfortable kind either. The kind that has a decision sitting in the middle of it, waiting. Lena spoke first. Is that true? She said. Which part? She turned. The wind moved a strand of hair across her cheek, and she didn't push it back. The part where I'm something you've decided is worth understanding. I looked at her. The wrong answer was yes. Not because it wasn't true, it was true, but because I had been paying attention for 6 weeks, and I knew what saving sounded like to her. I knew what happened when someone decided she needed handling. It had taken 7 years to get that out of her posture, and she was still working on it. And I was not going to be the next person who looked at Lena Voss and saw a problem with a solution. Yes, I said. But Carver got one word wrong. She waited. He said, saving. I don't watch structures to save them. I watch them to understand what they can hold. I held her gaze. There's a difference. Something moved through her expression. She knew about differences. She had told me that the first week, over coffee, the compensation is the problem. You stop hearing something and you just reorganize everything else to fill the space. I've been trying to decide for 6 weeks, she said quietly, whether you were actually paying attention or whether I wanted you to be. And a long pause. Her jaw tightened slightly. I'm afraid it's both. Not a confession. More honest than a confession. The thing underneath the confession, the fear that wanting something to be true might have made her see it where it wasn't. I said, you've been making yourself easy to be around for a long time. She went very still. I'm not asking you to do that, I said. I didn't come to this bridge today because you were convenient. I didn't say what I said at that table because you needed looking after. I'm here because you put that pencil down on my work and you didn't take it back. And because when Hideo Tanaka told me about 5 years of waiting until he was sure, I went home and looked at a rolled up blueprint for 40 minutes. Well, the stillness in her changed quality. Became the other kind, not guarded. Something opening. You knew what that meant, she said. The pencil. I knew what it meant. You didn't say anything. No. Why not? I looked at the water below us, then back at her. Because you needed to decide without me standing in the way of the deciding. Her eyes went bright. Not tears yet. Something held carefully just above that threshold. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the yellow pencil and held it between us. I looked at it. I knew what she was doing, not offering it, not giving it, showing it to me fully. The way you show someone something you've been holding close for a long time and are now finally willing to let be seen. I took it from her. It was lighter than I expected. 4 inches of worn yellow paint and a missing eraser cap and however many years of certainty stored in it. I held it for a moment, then I handed it back. I don't need it, I said. You do, but I know what it means now. She closed her hand around it. Something in her face shifted, settled. The look of a person who has been carrying something a long way and has finally found somewhere it belongs, not surrendered, just recognized. I'm not good at this, she said, in case that wasn't obvious. Which part? Letting someone. She stopped, started again, not making it easy, not managing everything in advance so nothing disappoints anyone. Her voice was even, her eyes were not. I've been told I'm a lot of work, I said, by someone who didn't want to do any. A breath, sharp and small, like something that had been pressing against a wall for a long time, found the wall briefly gone. She stepped toward me, not a fall, not something that happened to her, a decision, the kind that comes after someone has thought about something long enough to be certain, not reckless, not impulsive, just finished deliberating. She put her hand against my chest, looked at me once to confirm what she already knew, and kissed me. The bridge held, the wind kept going. She kissed me the way someone does when they've been standing at a threshold long enough to know exactly what's on the other side and have decided it's worth the crossing. I put my arm around her and pulled her in, and she made a small sound I had not heard before, not surprise, relief, the sound of something set down after a long carry. When she pulled back, her forehead came to rest against my jaw. Neither of us said anything immediately. The river moved below us. The access gate at the far end of the bridge was empty. After a moment, I said, "The line is still in the blueprint." Against my shoulder, quietly, she said, "I know." 2 sentences. That was all. It was exactly enough. Sunday morning, 2 days later, she had a drip coffee maker that took 9 minutes and she timed it like a fixed variable. I was sitting at her kitchen table, a different table, smaller than mine, with a fruit bowl that held 1 lemon and nothing else, when she handed me a mug and said, automatically, reflexively, the way breathing is reflexive. Is that okay? I took the mug. Lena. She paused with her own cup halfway to the counter. What? You don't have to ask if the coffee's okay. She went very still. The same stillness I had learned to read, not offense, not hurt, something older. The reflex catching itself in the act. I know, she said. I know why you do it. She looked at me. A flash of something in her eyes, the fear, the old training, the 7 years of making herself frictionless enough that no one would decide she was too much. I'm not going anywhere because you stopped managing everything in advance, I said. That's not the arrangement. A silence. The kind that has embarrassment in it, not the warm sort. She looked away at the window. I've been doing it so long, she said, I don't notice anymore. Someone asks what I want for dinner, and I say whatever's easiest, and I don't even register that I said it. I noticed. She looked back at me. That might be more unsettling than the habit. Good, I said. Notice that you've been noticed. That's new information. Work with it. Something shifted in her expression, the beginning of a real smile, the kind that arrived late and stayed. You sound like Carver. Carver has a 64-year head start. She crossed to the table and sat down across from me, both hands around her mug. The early light was doing something specific to the kitchen pail, direct, the kind of morning light that doesn't soften anything and doesn't need to. Then she said, "At the gala, I waited. You didn't know it would land right. You could have made things worse for me in that room. You didn't know enough about Aldridge to know how he'd respond, or whether he'd make it harder for me afterward." She looked at her mug. "You just said it anyway." "Yes. Why?" I had given her the answer on the bridge, but she was asking again, and I understood why, not because she hadn't believed it, because she wanted to see if it held on ordinary ground, in a kitchen, on a Sunday, without the wind and the water and the moment, because it was accurate, I said. And because you'd been quiet about it for long enough. She looked at me. That's the same answer, she said. It's the only one I have. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, came around to my side of the table, and put her arms around me from behind her cheek against my back, her hands crossed over my chest. She didn't say anything. I put my hand over hers. The coffee went cold. Neither of us moved. On the windowsill, in the light, was the lemon from the fruit bowl she'd moved at some point, and beside it, angled against the glass, the yellow pencil. Not because she'd been about to use it, because it lived there now, on the sill where she kept things she wanted to see. 3 weeks after the bridge, I was in the clinic waiting room at 12:15, and the receptionist looked up and said, "She'll be out in a few minutes," without reaching for the sign-in clipboard. I had not signed in as a patient since March. I sat in the same chair where I had picked up the 3-year-old magazine and read the same paragraph 4 times. The waiting room was the same, fresh paint, managed calm, the deliberate neutral of a place that didn't want to add to anyone's fear. I wasn't afraid of anything. I was just waiting for someone. That was the small thing that was different. It was not, in fact, small. 3 months later, I was making coffee in my kitchen while Lena sat on the couch behind me taking a call from a colleague about a case. I was not trying to listen, but her voice came through clearly, and what I heard made me stop with my hand on the kettle. She was describing a diagnostic process, a complex one, a presentation that had been misread twice before it came to her. She used precise terms without hedging them. She didn't soften the language or redirect credit. She said I assessed, and my interpretation was in the data indicated direct, exact, unqualified. She paused when the colleague said something, and then she said evenly, "I disagree with that reading. Here's why." I stood at the counter and did not move. Not because competence was a surprise. I had always known what she was capable of. Because she didn't sound like someone waiting to be corrected. She sounded like someone who had stopped waiting entirely. She hung up. A moment of quiet. Then, "Is the coffee done?" "Yes," I said. I brought her the mug and said nothing else. She didn't ask why I was looking at her like that. She had started to let that go, the explanations, the bracing for the reaction. She took the coffee and I sat beside her and she leaned slightly into my shoulder and that was all. Not because she needed to be close, because she wanted to be. 6 months after the bridge, I was in a project review meeting when my director ran through the Merritt Avenue report and made an offhand remark about a load anomaly I had flagged within acceptable parameters, he said. Probably a variance in the original specs. I set down my pen. I flagged it because it's outside the tolerance the original design specified under the amended traffic load. I said, "I'd like to request a secondary assessment before we sign off." He looked at me. The room looked at me. I did not explain further. I did not soften it or offer concession or suggest that of course he might be right. I had made note of an accurate thing and I intended it to be heard. He approved the secondary assessment. The anomaly required a repair. Afterward, Hideo caught me in the parking lot. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "You've been different lately." How? He thought about it. Like you stopped waiting until you were sure you wouldn't mess it up. I got in my truck. "Yeah." I said, "The hospital foundation held a smaller event in October, an informal donors dinner, nothing like the February gala. I went because Lena asked if I wanted to come, and I did. Aldridge was there. I saw him clock us from across the room at some point in the evening, register whatever he registered, and recalibrate, old instinct, assess the damage, map the professional implications, consider how this looked, what it changed, whether Lena would pay for it. What I actually did, kept watching Lena. She was talking to a donor, a young woman in her 30s who had, I gathered, gone through a complicated auditory recovery and wanted to understand the process better. Lena was explaining it with her full attention, the way she explained things when she had stopped managing how much space she was allowed to take up. Her hands moved when she talked. She smiled at something the woman said, a real one. The kind that started somewhere behind her eyes and arrived late to her face. Somewhere in my peripheral vision, Aldridge moved toward the bar. I didn't track it. There was nothing there worth tracking. What this cost, I think about that sometimes, not with regret, but with the particular respect you give to a thing that was expensive and turned out to be worth it. What I almost lost was not Lena. I hadn't found her yet when I almost lost it. What I almost lost was the version of myself that was still capable of showing up for something I couldn't fix. The Claire thing had taught me a lesson, and I had learned it perfectly and applied it badly, turned it into a policy rather than a correction. I would only be present for things I had a functional role in. Everything else was exposure I wasn't qualified for. I had been living in that policy for 2.5 years and calling it wisdom, and it had made me efficient and reliable, and if Hideo's 5 years had anything to teach me, eventually irrelevant to the things that mattered. What Lena risked was harder. She risked her own reading. 7 years of being wrong about someone does something to the part of you that decides who is safe to trust. Not just whether to trust other people, whether to trust yourself to know. She had walked into a clinic and handed a stranger an accurate assessment, and then spent 6 weeks deciding whether she had invented the accurate assessment because she wanted it to be true. That is a specific and underrated kind of bravery, the kind that looks exactly like uncertainty from the outside. She trusted herself to know what she was seeing, after everything that had made her doubt it. The specific detail, one Thursday, November, I showed up at her place with nothing. No pretext, no cabinet hinge, no practical reason to be there. I stood at the door, and when she opened it, she didn't ask what I needed. She just stepped back. I did not itemize a reason. She did not require one. We both stopped carrying things we didn't need to carry. You'd be surprised how much lighter that is. I have spent most of my professional life inside the discipline of finding what's failing. The invisible fault line, the structure that reads solid and isn't. I am trained to distrust the surface, to assume the problem is somewhere I haven't looked yet, to keep looking until I find it. That discipline has made me good at my job and, for a long time, very bad at being in a room with something that wasn't broken. Lena is not a structure I was analyzing. She is not a problem I solved, but she is the first person who made me understand that there is another kind of looking, not for the fault, but for the thing that has been holding everything else up while you were cataloging what's wrong. I was trained to find what was breaking. I had never learned to name what was holding. That is what I know now that I didn't know before. Not how to love someone, not how to stop being careful, how to look at something that appears fragile and ask a different question. Not where is the weakness, but what has this been carrying all along? The answer, in most cases, is more than you thought. On her windowsill, the yellow pencil still leans against the glass, 4 inches of worn paint and a missing eraser cap. Bent, clip, still bent, still here. She used it last week to mark a line on something she was reading. I was across the room. I didn't ask what. I already know what it's for. It's for lines she's certain about. We're getting there. And I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, if you had been trained your whole life to find what was failing, and then someone quietly, without announcement, turned out to be the thing that was holding the most weight, would you have seen it in time? Or would you have kept looking for the fault line until the variable changed? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. And if this story felt like something you needed today, if it said something about patience, or about the cost of staying careful, or about what it means to finally let yourself be seen by someone who's actually looking, share it with someone who might need it too. You probably already know who. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because next time, we're talking about what happens when the person you thought you were completely over shows up at exactly the wrong moment and turns out to be exactly the right lesson. I'll see you there.